So the French are mad at us over a deal that we struck with the British and the Australians. What's going on here? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. If you share my concerns, maybe you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, maybe even click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So the United States, Britain, and Australia announced a deal in which Britain and the United States would share our nuclear submarine technology with Australia, enabling them to deploy nuclear submarines in the Pacific. France is mad about this, and so is China, apparently. So what's going on here? Well, as is so often the case with international relations, you've got different interests kind of going up against each other, and it's led to some people being happy, some people being not so happy. The genesis of this whole situation happened when Australia struck a deal with France to purchase a bunch of non-nuclear submarines. The deal was the largest arms sale ever in the history of France. And in theory, these submarines were designed to try to counter an increasingly aggressive China in the Pacific. The problem that Australia soon realized is that these submarines are based on older technology, and as there have been cost overruns and delays, it turns out that by the time Australia received these new submarines from France, they would be easily detectable by the Chinese and wouldn't have the range to be able to really patrol deep into the Pacific to counter the challenge that China is providing Australia and the United States. In response, Australia came to the United States and the UK, two countries which obviously have very advanced nuclear submarines, and asked to enter a deal with us where it would purchase this new submarine technology from us. Submarine technology that would not be something that the Chinese would be able to detect, and which would allow the Australians to patrol much of the Pacific, much the way the United States currently does with our nuclear submarines. The problem, and the United States raised this with Australia, is that the French would probably be quite upset about this. To which Australia responded, let us worry about the French. Now you have to remember, France is the United States' oldest ally. And although over time we've become just as close with Australia and Britain and even Japan and Germany, France has been our stalwart ally all the way dating back to the Revolution. The French were particularly peeved because President Macron met with President Biden, and separately, Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with the French foreign minister while this deal was being negotiated with the UK and with Australia, and didn't mention it to the French. Even when at one point, the French foreign minister talked about how important this deal was to France. So you could understand where France would be a little peeved at us for going behind its back and doing this deal. The real party the French should be mad at, though, is Australia, with whom they had the deal in the first place. And frankly, Australia made a miscalculation by believing that the technology the French were offering them was going to be useful. Part of the problem with that miscalculation, though, is that it was based upon the fact that Australia, especially during the Trump era, was seeking to try to get along better with the Chinese, not being sure that the United States would always be there for them. But as Australia has tried to make these advances toward the Chinese, they've come to realize that China, with its increasingly aggressive presence, had no interest in being purely an ally of Australia, and that the kind of alliance of equals or alliance of friends that the United States tends to enter into with so many other developed countries is not the kind of thing the Chinese were interested in with Australia. As a result, when a new president came into office, and with the Australians realizing both that the Chinese were never going to get along with them, and that the technology the French offered was not only going to be coming too little too late, but also was not going to be of much help when they received it, Australia realized it was time to make a change. At that point, they should have approached the French. Now, what made this deal especially attractive to the British, of course, was that in the wake of Brexit now, they're looking to find new allies. They can't rely on the rest of Europe anymore the way they could when they were part of the European Union. As a result, this deal provides Britain with an opportunity to strengthen its relationships both with the United States and with Australia, two traditional allies it hopes will be able to kind of replace what it lost when it withdrew from the European Union. And finally, President Biden and American diplomats, for good reason, are very concerned about the increasingly aggressive rise of China in the Pacific. After all, we have very close allies in the Pacific who are really threatened by this rise. Not just Australia, but also Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Taiwan, you have to remember, is actually traditionally part of China. And the Chinese government in Beijing actually believes that Taiwan is still part of a greater China. As a result, the possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is not something that is without basis. Really, the only thing that has stopped that has been the strength of the United States in that part of the world. Well, considering the fact that there are many more people in Asia than in Europe, and that the Asian economies are growing much faster than the European economies, President Obama has sought to do a shift to the Pacific, as he called it, a pivot to Asia. And the centerpiece of that pivot was the TransPacific Partnership. Now, we have to remember, when the United States tends to enter these deals, generally speaking, we enter deals that are beneficial to both parties. That's why countries want to be allies of the United States, because we give them the opportunity to do well. China and Russia, on the other hand, when they enter deals with other countries, what they look to do is really to make the deals something that benefits them at the expense of the other country. In the United States, we believe that we can grow the pie by entering these deals, whereas China and Russia just want to take a bigger piece of it. And frankly, that's been a strength of United States foreign policy since World War II. Now, that approach of treating our allies equally, though, is exactly what resulted in President Trump and others attacking the Trans-Pacific Partnership as not being something that would benefit the United States enough. So as we all know, President Trump, as one of his first acts in office, withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, we have to remember, though, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was never purely about trade. What the Trans-Pacific Partnership was about was strengthening the United States alliance throughout the Pacific and Asia. Foreign policy, after all, nowadays is much more driven by economics than it is driven by military strength. So the fact that this agreement had been crafted by President Obama across the Pacific was something that would have tied all these countries closer to the United States, even though most of them geographically are closer to China. Now, perhaps not ironically, after the United States withdrew from this agreement, the other countries that were part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership still ended up making the deal amongst themselves, because they realize that they want to have some type of combined strength that allows them to stand up to China. And what's more is later on in the Trump administration, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo actually tried to both re-enter the agreement and also craft new agreements in Asia Pacific to try to address the strategic gap that had been left when President Trump pulled us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As always, by the way, I'll provide links to the documentation of everything I'm saying down below. And finally, realizing the threat that stronger relations between the United States and Australia and other Pacific and Asian countries represents, China is now trying to join what used to be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, basically to take our place in the agreement that we had originally crafted. So what does all this mean to us? Well, first of all, it means that France is mad because they lost a big defense contract. It's hard to blame them, but they'll get over it. The UK, for its part, after Brexit, is looking for allies in the United States and Australia that it can rely upon to replace the allies that it lost when it withdrew from the European Union. Australia is realizing that China is a much graver threat than it originally thought, that there is no way that they'll be able to get along with China the way they have traditionally with the United States, and that they need to have access to the advanced technology the United States and the UK can provide to help them protect themselves from an increasingly aggressive China. And finally, President Biden is looking to strengthen the American ties in Asia Pacific to replace what was lost when President Trump withdrew us from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Ultimately, what this means is an increase in what is turning into a Cold War between the United States and its allies versus China. Now, there is some concern that this Cold War could eventually lead to a hot war. I tend to think that that's unlikely. Both the United States and China realize that too much is at stake. Our technology has made it such that a hot war would be devastating to everybody. Plus which, the United States and China have very tight commercial bonds at this point, so the economies of both countries would be severely hurt by any kind of military confrontation. Nevertheless, China, rightfully actually, believes that it has not been given its place on the world stage that it deserves given its size and history. And it wants to be treated at least as an equal by the United States, if not as our superior. And they're behaving increasingly aggressively to achieve those ends, including by threatening our close allies such as South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Australia, and so many of the other allies that we've got spread across the Pacific Basin. Well, if you have any comments or questions about that, I'd love to see your comments down below. And if you could give this video a like, maybe subscribe to this channel, I'd sure appreciate that. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.